Hi, I'm Eliot, the IELTS expert at Magoosh, and I love helping students achieve their band score goals. In this lesson, we're going to be thinking about IELTS Writing Task 1 prompts for the General Training exam. Now, you may or may not know there are two basic types of General Training Task 1 prompts. You have to write letters that are either going to be informal or formal. Now, the IELTS exam doesn't tell you which one your letter is going to be. You need to be able to identify what's appropriate for the Task 1 prompt that you've been given. So in this lesson, we're going to be thinking about how to identify formal and informal letters. We'll look at some tips on how to respond to each type of question, and then we'll look at some sample essays so you can think through how to put those tips to use. Let's take a look at informal and formal letters for Task 1. Let's begin by looking at some sample questions. So first here we have a sample informal Task 1 prompt. Let's look at it quickly. It says, you just moved to a new city to begin a new job. Write a letter to a friend. In your letter, tell your friend about your new job, describe the neighborhood where you will live, and invite him or her to visit you. All right, now, how do we know this is an informal letter? IELTS doesn't tell you in the prompt, okay? You won't get this information in the prompt that they provide. You have to look for clues in the question itself. And the number one clue that will tell you that you're looking at a prompt that requires an informal response is that it's written to a friend. Most of the informal responses are to friends. Possibly very close family members could work as well, but more commonly, the friend will be someone you're writing to, okay? And the topic will also be very informal as well. Here, you're just giving your friend an update about this new job and this new city you're living in. Okay, you can tell by the context, if you were to write a letter like this in real life to one of your friends, you would use casual language. You would not use overly formal language, almost certainly, right? Okay, so this is your major clue that you're looking at an informal Task 1 prompt. Formal letters, there's a range of different kinds of people you might write for formal letters, okay? Here's an example of a prompt that would require a formal response. It says, your employer asked you to move your desk to a new location in the office building, which you believe will have a negative impact on you. Write a letter to your manager. In your letter, explain why you like your current location in the office building, describe the problems you'll face if you must move your desk, and propose a solution to the problem. Okay, a few things here. You're writing your manager. Okay, so already this is a more formal situation than the previous letter we looked at where you're writing a friend, right? Not only are you writing your employer, your manager at least, you're also talking about a sensitive topic. There's a new policy and there's a negative effect on you from the new policy. So you're going to have to use careful, formal language in this letter. Now, you may get informal Task 1 prompts that are written to all kinds of different people. Okay, so one example would be sort of an anonymous person. Maybe you're supposed to write a letter to a government official, okay, somebody in your local government. Maybe they don't even provide you a name of a person to write to in that situation. Okay, that's going to be another example of a formal letter. Okay, you may have to write a doctor, a manager at a restaurant. You may need to write, again, a government official of some kind. These will be more formal letters whenever you have to write to folks like those. Now let's look at some very specific tips about things you should do in both types of letters. Okay, beginning with formal letters, we're going to think about what you should do for basically the easiest part of the letter, the greetings and the endings in formal letters first. So for your greetings in your formal letter, some things to avoid. First of all, don't use dear plus the first name. That's something you should do only in informal letters. In formal letters, you're going to use different titles, okay? So they may give you the last name of the person. So you could write Dear Mr., Mrs., or Ms., and then the last name of the person. You could use a title if one is provided, like Dear Doctor or Dear Professor, okay? If there's no name provided in the prompt, you should use something like Dear Sir or Dear Madam, okay? So those are ideas for greetings for these formal letters. Okay, and then your endings, how you're closing the letter when you're all finished with the body of your letter. Pretty simple stuff for formal letters. You can use one of these closing remarks here: sincerely, yours faithfully, cordially, and then you should end with your full name. Okay, all of this is pretty straightforward. The greetings and endings, pretty simple stuff for formal letters. For informal letters, equally simple. In these, you simply need to begin with dear, then the first name of your friend whom you're writing, and finish all of that with a comma, and then you're ready to write, okay? Really simple for informal letters. Closings, also pretty simple. I suggest ending your letter with your friend if you're writing to a friend, okay? So your friend, comma, and then just include your first name. It would be too formal to put your full name most of the time. Close friends don't do that usually. So you just end the letter with your friend, comma, your first name, and you're all set. You could also use some of these closing remarks at the end as well, and they're perfectly fine, perfectly informal ways to end a letter. All right, now let's get into some more of the complicated stuff. So, one of the things that will make your letter either formal or informal is the kind of language you use. So it's important to know which kind of language is appropriate for formal and informal letters. So let's take a look at that. First, starting with formal letters. So some grammar ideas here. Go back and make sure you're studying your modal verbs, okay? Because many of the modal verbs that we use in English are used for politeness, okay? So, would you mind? Could you do this or that? May I? Asking for permission with may, or saying that something might happen, okay? It's less direct. It's usually quite a bit more formal when you want to make a request or suggest something to use modal verbs. So if you need to, make sure you go back and study how we use modal verbs for politeness in English. Now that's a long grammar topic. We don't have time for it in this lesson, but there are many places on the web or possibly in your textbooks. If you have your own grammar textbooks, go back and revisit those. You'll want to use modal verbs appropriately on your formal responses, in your formal letters. Okay, another tip here, don't use contractions, okay? In your formal letters, you should avoid these contractions, don't or isn't, won't, okay? These are considered informal writing. You should spell them out completely, okay? That is going to be a much more formal way of writing words that might be typically contracted. In addition to grammar, you need to make sure that the tone and substance of your letter are appropriate for a formal Task 1 response. Okay, so what do we mean by that? Well, the tone is going to be basically the mood of the letter. Is your mood joking? Is it very casual? Or is it serious in some way? Well, your formal letters are going to be much more serious than your informal letters. And you want to make sure that you avoid being too familiar with the person you're writing to. In your culture, it may be perfectly appropriate to joke around with your manager. I know in mine, it certainly is. But in these letters, you want to assume that the topic is very serious. You don't want to treat the person you're writing as though you are friends, okay? So don't be too familiar or casual with the person you're writing in your formal letters. You also need to be thoughtful and objective. You need to show in what you're writing that you're giving serious consideration, okay? Often there's going to be some problem that you need to complain about or you need to try to resolve in some way. You don't want to make a really strong argument where you're really being forceful with what you're saying. You need to show that you're being considerate with your idea. So you're thinking of what the other side of the issue might think about what you're writing, okay? And you might find a way to mention that, you see that the issue is complex, but you would argue for this or that solution to the issue. Okay, that would be a way of being thoughtful and objective. Now, we're going to see an example of that later in this lesson when we look at a sample response to our formal letter question. So we'll take a closer look at how to do that in just a moment. Okay, third here, make suggestions carefully and avoid confrontation. This is related to what we just said, but you certainly don't want to be too argumentative, or you don't want to be overly emotional in your letters, okay? That won't be an appropriate tone in your formal letters for IELTS. Seriousness is good, but being confrontational, being overly angry in your letters, definitely not good. Okay. And the last one, consider the audience. You need to think through, who is this person that I'm writing? Is it somebody in my city or my company that has significant power in some way? Is it somebody who you don't know, you're not familiar with at all? They may be a manager at a company that you're writing to get a refund for something like that. You need to really think about who that person is and imagine how you would write to that person in real life. How would you respond if you really had to write the letter that IELTS is asking you to write in real life? Well, doing that means that you're taking a moment to really think through who that person is, and that should affect how you address that person. Okay, again, we'll look at examples of how to put these to use in a moment later in the lesson. Let's first look at similar tips, though, for our informal letters, okay? So, some tips here. Make sure you're not too informal, okay, with these letters. This is something that comes about every now and then when I work with students, where they're using language that they maybe use in text messages or on social media, right? You're using incomplete words, spellings of words, okay, or slang phrases, LOL, OMG, those kinds of things. They do not belong in your task 1 responses. So you can definitely, even though you certainly use this kind of language with your friends, it is too informal for your task 1 responses. You can use contractions in these letters. In fact, I would recommend that you do. It shows IELTS that you understand that contractions are normal and perfectly fine to use in informal situations. Okay, so when you have your isn'ts and don'ts and won'ts that you can write out, do contract them in your task 1 letters that are to friends, that are informal letters. Okay, now the tone and substance of informal letters. So just contrasting with what we just heard about for the formal letters just a moment ago. In these letters, you should write as though you are very comfortable with the person you're writing to, okay? If you are overly formal, if you're using a lot of modal verbs to speak really, really carefully about a topic to your friend, it will seem too formal for these letters in most cases. So make sure you're writing in such a way that it's very clear you know this person well, okay? And some more tips about that same kind of thing here. You can be very direct in these letters in many ways. You can be to the point. In the example of the formal letter that you would write to a manager, where you have to consider this problematic seating arrangement at your office, okay, you would have to be very careful about how you would address that topic, because we assume your manager has some good reason for wanting to change the seating arrangement in the office. And so you'd have to be careful. You can't just come out and be really direct about how awful you think that new policy is, right? Well, with a friend, you can be much more direct about things. If you don't like something, you can usually be open and honest about those things. And that would be appropriate for your informal letters, to be direct about what you think about something. Okay, we'll see some examples of that a little bit later in the lesson. In informal letters, now not all of the time, but in many cases, you can express feelings and emotions. Okay, you can talk about how you're excited or frustrated or how you regret something. Feelings and emotions will be much less appropriate for your formal letters in almost all cases, okay? You don't talk about your feelings and emotions most of the time, for better or worse, with your boss, with your manager. Okay, you might, but in these letters, it's almost never going to be appropriate. By contrast, in your informal letters, it's going to be fine to mention, how you feel excited about something or how you're dreading something or not looking forward to something. That would be a normal topic that you would write to a friend. And so it works for your informal letters on task 1. Now let's look at our sample questions and just apply some of these tips and look at how they would make a difference in the responses we provide to both of these sample prompts. We've got our sample prompt here. You're writing to your manager and you're discussing this new desk location that you don't like, that's causing problems for you. Okay, so let's apply our ideas about tone and substance in particular. Look at some examples of some appropriate things you could say in response to this prompt. All right, so we had our tip about formal letters that we need to avoid being too familiar and casual. So let's take a look at this sample response down below. It says, I understand why the company has determined it to be necessary to reorganize the office space. However, I would like to suggest that my situation may require an exception. Notice how this response is not casual or familiar at all. If you were saying this exact idea to a close friend, you would probably say it quite differently, right? So imagine this informal response. So we've known each other for a long time, Samantha. Please do me a favor and help me stay in my current location. What this writer wants is to stay where he or she is in the office. Okay, so if this was your friend you're writing to, you would say, just do me a favor. I don't want to move. Please let me stay where I am. Contrast that with this formal response. I understand why the company has determined it to be necessary to reorganize the office space. Okay, I would like to suggest, if you're writing to someone who's your manager or who is higher up in your company even, you would be very careful not to make a really strong request like, do me a favor, right? You would be more careful than that. And that's what we see here. The example up above is not written to someone familiar or someone with whom the person has a very close or comfortable relationship. So just contrast those two sentences there. That's the appropriate tone you'd want to strike for your formal letter. Okay, we also said earlier that it's important to be thoughtful and objective. Okay, now looking at the same sample sentence down below, check out what we have here. I understand why the company has determined it to be necessary to reorganize the office space. That's a perfect example of being thoughtful. Okay, you're showing your manager, hey, I understand why this policy might need to occur, why it's important to you and the company. That's being thoughtful. You're showing your manager that you're concerned about it, that you care, okay? Contrast that with what we see down below. I find it difficult to understand why I'm being asked to move my desk. Okay, now that comes across as very angry, okay? That person is upset, and this person may be upset. But in a formal letter to his or her manager, it would be important to show that you're being considerate, that you're being thoughtful of the different decisions that the manager has to make and the different factors the manager certainly must be weighing in trying to make this decision. So being objective, being thoughtful. Here's a great example of how to achieve that tone in your formal letters. Okay, now this person also is going to make a suggestion, right, about how to resolve the issue at the company. Okay, and we want to make suggestions carefully. We don't want to just force opinions or say something has to happen one way or the other. All right, so this person is going to make a very careful suggestion here. I would appreciate it very much if you would consider leaving my desk in its current location. All right, I would appreciate it. That shows, okay, this is something that I understand is important to you, but this would also be something that I appreciate a lot too. I'm not demanding that you do it. I'm just saying I'd appreciate it if you would consider this. Okay, so leaving some room for the person to make a decision on the other side. Contrast that with the bad example down below. My desk must remain in the same place. Okay, very forceful. That's not a careful suggestion at all. That's a demand, and you want to avoid those kinds of demands in your formal responses. Finally, then, the tip we saw earlier in the lesson was to consider your audience. Okay, well, what does that mean? Well, in this case, a manager would be convinced by a business reason for retaining your seating location, right? If the manager at work may or may not care about your personal preferences or circumstances, right? Maybe this is a big company and this manager has 100 people to consider. Certainly the manager may listen to everybody's personal interests, but sometimes decisions have to be made that are not everybody's going to like, okay? That's just a normal thing at a company, okay? What might be very convincing to a manager is if you can not only make it just about a personal preference you have, but about something that is good for the company. So if you're considering your audience, you're considering what might be realistically convincing to a manager at your job, you can achieve an appropriate tone and substance of your letter by imagining what to say in that scenario in real life, and then writing about that in your letter. Okay, so let's take a look here. Here's an example. I work with the marketing department for most of my projects. My work benefits greatly by being physically close to members of that team. Proximity helps us to collaborate easily. However, in the new arrangement, I will be positioned 3 floors above the marketing team. I'm concerned that this will lead to inefficiencies. Okay, so this would show that you understand the appropriate substance of a letter that you might write to a manager in this situation, okay? Again, contrasting it with something that would be less formal, an informal letter, you might have all kinds of personal reasons you would tell a friend why you don't like some kind of policy you're experiencing at your job, okay? But when you're writing to a manager, it has to be an appropriate substance of your letter for that situation. Okay, so in this case, we have down below a business reason why the manager might want to consider making an exception, in your case, to the new policy about moving desks. Okay, now let's take a look at the informal letter and the points we discussed earlier in the lesson about how to respond appropriately to informal prompts. So remember, we said it's important to be comfortable and casual with the person you're writing to. Okay, so it would be perfectly fine to say something like, "I can't wait for you to visit so I can show you my neighborhood," right? Showing excitement. That is something you would really say to a friend you haven't seen for a long time, or somebody who's coming to visit you in your new city. Contrast that with what we see down below. "I would like to describe my neighborhood to you." Okay, would you write that to a friend? Well, to my ear, it sounds very formal, overly formal, because it's almost like you're making a suggestion or you're almost asking permission of the person to describe your new neighborhood, right? You wouldn't do that with a friend. You would say something much different, which is, "Hey, I'm excited you're coming. I can't wait to show you my new location." That tone is appropriate for an informal letter. We also said that you should be direct and to the point with your friends, okay? So we got a nice long example here. Let's look at this one. It says, "I like many things about my new job at the Gazette. I get to do a lot of science writing, which is why I originally took the job. Each week, I write a few short pieces about medical and health stories. It's possible I'll take on larger projects in the future after I gain more experience at the paper. However, sometimes I wonder how long I will stay here. The editor is very demanding, and many of the people I work with are intense and competitive. The fast-paced environment can be fun, but not when people get overly upset about minor things." Okay, this person is being open and honest about his or her true feelings about this new job, about the Gazette, okay? There are some really great things that the person mentions, but the person is also being very direct about some things that are not so great. Being open and honest about the fact that this person may not stay here very long because there are some things like how intense it is and how competitive it is that aren't very pleasant. Okay, so this is an example of being direct, being to the point with your friend, okay? Imagine you're writing to your manager at this company. Maybe this person had to write a letter to the manager of the Gazette. Do you think that you would be very open and honest about all of your opinions about whether people are too competitive or too intense, especially if this is a new job for you? Most people probably would say no. You probably wouldn't. You would probably hold on to some of those thoughts on your own because it might hurt your standing at the company in some way if you're overly honest about all the things you don't like. Okay, just an example of how this paragraph is appropriate for informal letters because this person is sharing ideas and feelings, thoughts very directly. Okay, now related to that, when it's appropriate, it's perfectly fine and in fact, really good to express feelings and emotion in your letter. That's something you would do with a friend. So, for example, my move hasn't been easy at times. The first few weeks were pretty lonely because I didn't know anyone here. But it was also exciting to explore the new city. Okay, so talking about being lonely, talking about things that are exciting, these are things that will come out in Task 1 letters because you're writing to a friend about your true thoughts, your true feelings about whatever it is you're experiencing. Many Task 1 prompts require you to do something like this, or at least it's possible to talk about these types of things with someone with whom you're very close. Okay, so this is an appropriate tone for your informal letters, and these tips that we've looked at for both informal and formal letters will help you to make sure that you're writing the appropriate kind of letter for your Task 1 response. Okay, now another thing that you'll want to focus on for your formal and informal letters is to study lots of vocabulary. If you click through on the link below, we've got some additional resources for you to look at in relation to formal and informal letters. We also have 2 additional sample questions, an informal question and a formal question. You could practice a response and then look at the sample response that's there. So make sure you click that link and check out those additional resources that are there. All right, I hope you liked the video. If you want more IELTS writing tips and strategies, check out these videos on the left, and I'll see you in the next lesson.